So I recently read an article in The Guardian about the risks and threats that AI poses to architecture. I was actually happy to see this because it suggests that at least some architects are starting to take this threat seriously. I've been thinking a lot about this since last November, and I wrote an article about it in Design Intelligence Quarterly in the spring. However, I worry sometimes that I may have been a little bit too subtle in discussing the potential impacts of AI and on architecture. I believe this is a real threat. A lot of my recent work has been in response to the widespread, in my opinion, completely Pollyannish idea that AI will automate away all the architectural tasks we don't like and essentially free up our time for more and more design. Maybe it's my Cassandra complex, but I really don't think that this is a likely scenario. So who's right? I think to properly consider the impact of AI on architectural practice, we really need to look more fundamentally at how technology has historically disrupted different industries, and then ask ourselves about this one in particular. That's what we're going to do today. We're going to take a wide-angle look at how AI is going to affect architectural practice and potentially architectural employment. And because architects' unemployment is a lifelong preoccupation of mine, and if you follow my work, you know that, we'll also be discussing how firms can leverage new technology to maintain full utilization without having to lay anyone off. There's a possible future here, I think, where we get to do more and better design, but we have to plan for it and build it. It won't just happen because the technology does. The first thing we're going to need to talk about is the architectural project cycle. It's something we're all familiar with, probably to the point where we don't even think about it. It's just the way architectural work is done. For most firms and most projects, architectural work follows some sort of curve. There's a little bit of work in the beginning, and as the project starts to take shape, there's this escalating amount of activity, culminating in tragically often last-minute rush to get all the construction documents done. After that, there's a long, steady engagement with the construction process where the architect is there to answer RFIs, take meetings, absorb abuse, and so on. Historically, at least for the last 100 years or so, architectural projects have always had this kind of shape, this general kind of curve to it. If you think about it historically, it makes a lot of sense, irrespective of the technology used to produce the designs. We see a curve because there are different demands based on different sets of tasks. Those different demands command a different kind of labor for each phase in the actual design cycle. The task in the middle might be considered more basic. And I don't want to insult anybody with that claim. You just don't need to know everything about being an architect in order to draw a wall section. You just need to know the basics about how a building goes together. You don't need to know the entire scope of any given project in order to draw the bathroom elevations for that project. The stuff at the beginning tends to be less basic and more rare in terms of skill, because the people who are doing that work at the beginning really have to have a holistic view of the firm's goals, the market in which the firm exists, the firm's health, how an entire building goes together, client psychology, all these different things. It's a rare set of skills, and it takes more experience to develop. Perhaps it's more rare because it takes more years. I don't know. Therefore, point is, there are a few people around to do it. Additionally, the stuff in the middle is usually more labor intensive. It's getting less so with CAD and BIM, and eventually with AI, but historically speaking, it's always been much more labor intensive to sit there and draw hundreds of Corinthian column capitals and things like that. So the work in the middle, the production of CDs and maybe kind of late stage design development, has historically required a larger amount of labor relative to things like pre-design and schematics. Overwhelming those earlier phases of pre-design and schematics with labor would be silly and unnecessary. You don't need 20 people sitting in an initial client meeting in order to get the firm the job. So the architectural project cycle takes on this kind of curve because the nature of the tasks in the beginning and the nature of the task at the end and the nature of the task in between those two are actually quite different. They require a different set of skills, they require different levels of experience. Certainly, it takes a high amount of competence, training, and experience to do anything that an architect does, but different tasks require different skills and experience. So we see this kind of clustering, escalating population of people in the middle before we transition to construction. The construction phase is actually a little bit different. The minute we hand over drawings, it becomes the contractor's project. The staffing level during CA is typically set by the project type, by the industry standard, by the project's complexity, all these different things. But the construction schedule is being done at the contractor's pace or the owner's pace. It's subject to material and labor supply issues, weather conditions, etc. The level of an architect's involvement is also to some degree determined by that contractor. If the contractor is a huge pain in the ass, then you need more people on the project. If the project is technically complex, maybe even more people than that. The point is that staffing on CA is primarily determined by forces and actors other than the architect herself. There is no way that you could cut a construction timeline in half by doubling the number of architects on CA. It just doesn't work that way. So the final part of the curve is usually long, low, and steady. This project cycle has held firm while the industry transitioned from hand drafting to CAD and then to BIM, precisely because it doesn't actually have anything to do with the technology being used to produce the designs. It has to do with the factors endogenous to architectural practice, like skill level, experience of different architects, firm size, etc., as well as with certain exogenous factors like contract arrangements, construction schedules, the weather. Now, will this project cycle persevere through the age of AI? Doesn't seem like it to me, but let's investigate. Undoubtedly, the curve has served us well. But if you never lived through the curve, it might strike you as an inconvenient way to organize a project. Doing multiple projects this way sequentially would be an absolute nightmare. It would be impossible to staff because, as a principal, you would constantly be hiring, firing, letting people go, looking for talent, and doing all these things rather than the actual design work. There's an intrinsic feast or famine character to the curve itself. Historically, we've managed to transcend that intrinsic limitation by stacking our projects. We do multiple projects at the same time, but not on the same schedule. And that's what gets us to a consistent staffing load that can then be managed. You can build a great team and dedicate staff time to whichever project or phase is in the most acute need of labor on any given day. It goes up and down a little bit, but what business doesn't? Now, before we continue, we have to define work itself. Work is simply a product of time and effort. A certain amount of effort applied over a certain period of time is essentially going to create the amount of work that you're looking at. 2 full-time equivalents for 6 months is equivalent to 2,040 hours of work. That's a working year. And this holds true regardless of how you distribute the work. So if you take that 2,040 hours of work, that's the entire project, and you add an additional architect, what do you get? You just get a 4-month project, right? So the project moves a little bit faster, but the amount of work remains consistent. Next, we got to talk about the effect of technological innovations, more generally. All technological innovations have one of 3 effects. It will either result in less effort, or it will result in less time, or it will result in both. The distinction can be a bit subtle, because if something takes less effort, it typically takes less time as well, or vice versa. In common language, we use work and effort interchangeably, but here's the way to think about it. Less effort is something like a self-driving car. If I buy a self-driving car, my commute to the office is still 30 minutes. The commute itself takes the same amount of time, but there's less effort involved because I don't have to do anything. So that frees up my time to do other tasks. Now, certainly you probably shouldn't be doing other things while you're behind the wheel of your self-driving car. That's what they say anyway, but why else would you invent a self-driving car or buy one? Anyway, less time is something like a microwave. Now, I have to press the same number of buttons on my microwave as I do on my oven in order to get it to cook something, but it does so much faster. So the overall task of making dinner is significantly temporally compressed, despite my identical level of effort. Both is something like Instacart. There's less effort in that there are tasks that I don't have to do, like carrying my groceries, but there's also time savings in the sense that I don't have to physically go to the store. Now, we can safely say that all adopted technological innovations have one of the 3 effects, because if they didn't, we wouldn't adopt them in the first place. So, how could such innovations affect the architectural project cycle? Considering a typical project cycle, and looking at it under scenario 1, which is less effort, the effects are conceptually pretty easy to understand. It just takes fewer people to do the thing. If doing a permit set used to take 2 people a week, and now because of some advance of technology it only takes 1 person a week, the second person is no longer necessary to complete that permit set in the same fixed amount of time. Scenario 2 has an effect in the other direction. So you take a given task and it just moves faster. So tasks at the exact same level of staffing can be completed in a much, much shorter period of time. In the third scenario, it's basically just a combination of both, right? Things get easier to do in the sense that there's less effort involved, but they can also simultaneously be executed faster at the same time. So you have 2 phenomena, less effort and less time, operating together, but independently. So what's the big deal? To me, it's a big deal because under scenario 1, you're basically looking at mass unemployment throughout the entire architectural profession. This is just a diagram, but it reflects a 50% reduction in the effort involved in architectural tasks. Now, at the peak of the Great Recession, we estimated that we had, 25% unemployment among architects? This would be way worse than that. And that's part of what I've been so mad about all this last year, is this chatter going on about AI is not going to cost any jobs, it's just going to automate tasks. That's exactly what a job is. It's just a bunch of tasks that you do in service of a project or a program. So if you have a technology that's eliminating 50% of the effort on all your tasks, you can eliminate 50% of the people. That's the cold reality, and I think architects really need to start getting serious about that. If you're a young professional, you need to keep a skeptical eye on anyone who tells you otherwise. The second effect can be equally devastating because it accelerates the design phase, creating gaps in the project cycle. If you're moving something faster, you better have a plan to deal with that. Scenario 2 is also the most seductive scenario because it creates all those gaps, and architects have been thinking that they'll just fill up their billable time with more and more design. Scenario 3 manifests the effects of both. So we have large periods of underemployment, but also mass unemployment because of this effect of having less time and simultaneously less effort involved in architectural tasks. I didn't write this believing that I was the first person to ever consider this. I wrote it because most of the solutions I've heard in response to these potential risks don't make any sense when viewed from a wider angle. In part 2, we're going to be breaking down some of these commonly held misconceptions about what could happen in response to AI's technological effects. Join us then, or just click on the video below. It should be right beneath this one.